time this day to join the webinar. I would like to take just a quick moment to be sure that the audio is making it to you. So if you will look on your dashboard over to the right, there should be a place to click to raise your hand to indicate that you can hear the sound of my voice. So if you would take a moment to do that, just so I can tell that I'm making it out to the rest of the world. I see a few hands going up. Oh, excellent. Looks like the audio is working well. So once again, I want to thank you for making time to join this webinar today. It is right at 4 o'clock, so we are going to get started. This webinar is, we advertise it as a webinar on the teacher leadership standards. The teacher leadership standards are certainly a part of what we're going to be talking about today, but I want to start with a little bit more broad view and talk a little bit about teacher leadership and identify the opportunities to lead and use that as the funnel or the pathway that leads us to the teacher leadership standards. I am Robert Sachs, and I'm a professional development leadership coordinator at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. I also helped to coordinate the team that built and designed the teacher leadership standards back in 2013 and 2014. So the subject of our webinar time this afternoon is the teacher leadership, identifying opportunities for teachers to lead. More specifically, what are the opportunities and the expectations for teacher leadership in the state of North Carolina? I do have several colleagues who are online with us this afternoon who will be helping to manage the questions bar. So as questions come up, we'll be able to address those. Some may be addressed individually through the questions bar, and others may be addressed to the whole group depending on the level of relevance. So the goals for today are to support your understanding, to support you to develop a deeper understanding of teacher leadership. We're going to start a little bit broadly and tighten up from there. Address the entry points for teacher leadership that are available to teachers throughout the career continuum from novice to veteran, and then explore the professional standards that frame the teacher leadership expectations for both classroom teachers as well as district-specific teacher leadership roles. So as we think about leadership, this term gets used very broadly, and the notion of teacher leadership is really, really popular right now nationally in terms of education in general. We have lots of discussion around how teachers can lead, what teachers need to do to be leaders. One of the things we know is that our legislators in North Carolina value teacher leadership, but most specifically they value the kind of leadership for teaching that keeps teachers teaching kids. So teacher leadership is it's a pretty hot topic in education right now. So I want to talk a little bit about what it means to lead generally. So I have a few images here on the screen I want to share with you about different kinds of leadership. And the first image you see in the upper left-hand corner, this is one kind of leadership. It's very clear from this image who the leader is. The leader has a special tool to amplify their voice to ensure that all of the other individuals in the group, those who should be following, are able to hear the instructions appropriately. This is a very specific kind of leadership, and it has its place. My nephew is a drill sergeant in the Marines, and this is the kind of leadership he was taught to convey, and it is how he does his work and how he does his job. If this were the expectations of a teacher leader every day in their school building, they probably wouldn't have very many followers for very long. But there is a time and a place for this kind of leadership. It's very directive and it's very instructive. In the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see a kind of leadership. Again, like the first image, the leader is visible. They stand out. They look different. In this case, these two leaders, for the first and the second example, they're physically a different color than the others in the example so that they stand out and they're easy to see. This leader is moving in a particular direction, and it's very clear that the followers are following pretty shortly along behind. So this is another kind of leadership. The leader in this case is leading by example, creating the general direction, the general movement, and the rest of the group is moving along in that same direction. They're following along. I see in the questions bar a couple of you are commenting that when I tell you there's a picture on the screen, you don't see it. That would be the cyberspace lag. I'll give myself a couple of seconds before I assume that things have made it through cyberspace to your screen. So you should be seeing very shortly, if not yet, on the bottom right-hand corner now, another kind of leadership. This third kind of leadership has in common with the other two the fact that the leader does look different, stands out, easy to find among the followers. This one is similar to the previous one on the bottom. The leader is plotting the direction and others are following. One of the differences here is this leader is identifying a very specific pathway. And you'll notice that in this case, the leaders are following exactly behind, footstep for footstep for footstep. And there are cases where this kind of leadership is important, and it's especially important in places where following specific procedures or specific statutes or policies are necessary. You might find this kind of leadership in EC requirements and expectations for the reports and the other practices and protocols that take place for exceptional children, or for processes where you're working to identify academically gifted students. There are particular methods and mechanisms to do this. One leader in your building who has to be like this kind of leader is your testing coordinator. Your testing coordinator is identifying steps and processes to properly follow the testing protocols, and they have to be followed exactly, or you end up with a misadministration. So there's three examples of leadership that are, they're different kinds of leadership. There's a time and a place for all of those kinds of leadership, but there needs to be a little bit of flexibility in our schools, because depending on the conditions, the type of leadership may change, and the needs may bounce between each of these three that are on the screen. In times of crisis, you may have the upper left-hand example. In times where following specific procedures is necessary, you may have the bottom right-hand example. But I want to share with you the last kind of leadership that I want us to think about today. One of the differences in this kind of leadership, if you look at it, is that the leader in this graphic doesn't look any different than those who are following. You couldn't really tell the difference. The size, the shape, the color of the person is the same. But the leadership in this case comes from the direction. The leadership comes from the direction. So in this case, you see this leader at this time is holding a red arrow. I like to call this example red arrow leadership. So red arrow leadership is an example where the leadership comes from the direction. The leadership is coming from the direction. And in the case of this example, if this individual were not able to continue to carry this arrow, to chart the direction and to chart the course, someone else could step from behind and pick up that arrow and keep it moving. We've had examples of red arrow leadership in our public schools for as long as we have had grade level teams working together to do work. If you think about a grade level team that works together, I'm a former elementary teacher, so grade level teams, you have in high schools and middle schools, you have content area teams, but those teams of teachers that work together. You'll have a teacher that will be the leader of that grade level group or the professional learning community for a period of years, and then something will change, someone new will come along, and they pick up the red arrow and they keep the work moving forward for the third grade team or the history department in the high school. Red arrow leadership is something that public schools have been really good at for a really long time. We just haven't always talked about it in quite that way. So as we think about leadership and the different kinds of leadership, what do teacher leaders do? And in what ways do teachers lead? And that's an important question. And it's a question some of you, if you're principals, may have teachers now saying to you, I want to be a teacher leader, but I'm not exactly sure what it is that I need to be doing or what's available to me to be a teacher leader. So I want to talk a little bit about what teacher leaders do. So back in 2007, which is about the same time that our standards that we use for evaluating teachers right now are being written, Harrison and Killian, Cindy Harrison and Joellen Killian, were doing some research. And they wrote an article that was in educational leadership called 10 Roles for Teacher Leaders. This article came from some research that they did where they asked hundreds of teachers, are you a teacher leader? And if the teacher said yes, they said, tell me what you do. And they wrote that down on a little piece of paper. And they collected all of those little pieces of paper for what those teacher leaders did. And then they started sorting them out into piles. And depending on what the teacher said, they started making stacks of piles of similar responses from different teachers. And what they ended up with was 10 different ways that teachers said that they led. These, in the article, they referred to these as the 10 roles for teacher leaders. So what you see on the screen right now are those 10 roles for teacher leaders. I want to take a moment to orient you to this document because I'm going to talk through it for about the next 5 or 10 minutes. This document is available to you in the dashboard as a handout. So there is a place in the dashboard where you can get this handout. One of the things I am going to ask my colleagues who are on the questions bar to do for me is push a hot link to it out through the questions bar to each of you. So if one of you would pick that up, do a reply all in the questions bar, you can have a hot link where you can get to this document and actually view it on your computer directly. And if you save this link, you could come back to this document in the future if you wanted to. So hopefully either via the handout or the hot link, if you want this document in your hands to manipulate, you can get to it. But I want to talk through it just very quickly. So what you see here are the 10 roles of teacher leadership. In parentheses, after each of the roles, there is a number in parentheses. This is simply the number of the order in which you will find these in the article, 10 roles for teacher leaders. So number 1 is resource provider, and it's the first one that they discuss in the article. Number 10 is a learner, and it's the last one that they discuss in the article. But what you see on this graphic with these 3 columns, I've taken the time to organize these into 3 discrete categories. And the categories are important as we start to think about where teachers can access leadership opportunities, whether they can get them from the teacher standards or whether we need to lean to the teacher leadership standards to find and identify those leadership opportunities and then ultimately to measure them. So I want to talk a little bit about these columns. The first column is called the informal teacher leadership. This is self-initiated. There's no permission to be an informal teacher leader. So there's 3 examples here. One is a resource provider. And if you think about it, a teacher without anybody's permission can offer resources to another teacher and another colleague to try to help them out. The second one you'll find in the first column is called a catalyst for change. When a teacher sees that something needs to change and they want to champion that effort to change it, whether it's a 3rd grade teacher on the 3rd grade team who realizes the scores on the most recent assessment were a lot lower than they expected and they want to try to figure out an instructional process to try to get at that, that person can be a catalyst for change. They can be a leader in that direction all by themselves without anybody's permission. And then the third one in this informal column is a learner. Anytime a teacher recognizes that there's a gap in what they know or a gap in what they know how to do, they can seek out opportunities to learn. They can learn from colleagues, they can learn from books, they can learn from the internet. But being a learner is a way to be a leader that is self-initiated. You don't need anybody's permission, and you can be a leader, a learner, all by yourself without anybody's permission. So resource provider, catalyst for change, and learner are 3 examples of teacher leadership discovered by Harrison and Killian that teachers said they were doing when they were leaders, but they're informal. They can be done independently, all by themselves. And if you think about it, when a student comes to you to work at your school right out of college and they're in their very first year of teaching, some of those teachers may not think they can be a teacher leader, and yet even someone right out of college with a probationary teaching license can still be a resource provider to support their peers, be a catalyst for change when they see that something in the building needs to change, and they can be a learner. In fact, we hope they will continue to be a learner for the rest of their career. When you move to the second column, you will see that there are 2 kinds of leadership here in the second column. This is labeled semi-formal. And these are semi-formal because the system, the building, the other colleagues in the building have to support this kind of teacher leadership. And so basically, where the first column, the informal, was self-initiated, and you didn't have to have anybody's permission. For the semi-formal, you've got to at least have somebody else to play along. So as a classroom supporter, if one teacher wanted to help another teacher, that second teacher has to be willing, and they have to be open to accept that support and assistance. And then a data coach is a fancy way to say that two teachers are working together, looking at student data. It could be hard assessment data, it could be soft instructional data, but those teachers are working together, looking at the data, trying to encourage one another to improve the outcomes of what that data is measuring. And so Harrison and Killian call that a data coach. Well, those two semi-formal opportunities, you have to have someone else, at least one other individual who is willing to play along to be that kind of a leader. So I want to stop there in addressing the three columns. We're just going to stop with these first two columns. So 5 of the 10 roles for teacher leaders fall into the first two categories: informal, kind of leadership you can do all by yourself without permission, and semi-formal, leadership that you have to have at least one other person to participate with you to take on that opportunity to lead. So I want to move forward, though, and ask you to think a little bit about what opportunities teachers have to lead. We talked about those three kinds, but what opportunities do teachers have to be learners? As you think about the teachers who are in your space where you work, do those opportunities come to them in very formal ways, or do teachers have to seek out those opportunities and find them for themselves? As teachers ask for ways to lead and support their colleagues and improve instruction and systems in buildings, some teachers are better at navigating and finding those opportunities for themselves. Other teachers need guidance and direction. The easiest leadership opportunities in buildings have to do with school improvement teams, some of the other systems and structures that are put together to help the school move forward. And those opportunities are readily available, they're highly visible, and often printed in black and white at the beginning of the school year for teachers to think about. But there are other opportunities that teachers have to lead that they may have to be pointed out, or they may have to be reminded of what those opportunities are. The question, though, related to that is, what responsibilities do teachers have to lead? Why is it not okay for a teacher to just go in their room and close the door and do their thing? And the reason that that's problematic is because we don't have schools that are single classrooms anymore. We have schools that are collections of many, many, many classrooms. And as teachers engage in these teacher leadership opportunities as resource providers and learners and catalysts for change, we want the culture and the system of the building to improve education and improve the instruction for all of the students in the building, and to improve the professional practices and the professional experiences of all of the staff in the building. So that responsibility is intrinsic for teachers to help build the positive culture that we need in our public schools to help them be successful and help them to be productive, valuable, beneficial places to work and to live and to lead and to learn. So the question that I think is really important for teachers and administrators to think about is, where do those leadership responsibilities come from? Some are intrinsic. A teacher needs to be a learner when they need to be a learner because they need to be a learner. And we would hope that teachers don't have to be told that explicitly. But the expectations for teachers to be a leader are actually very explicitly stated. And I want to talk a little bit about those next. So as we think about where those responsibilities for teacher leadership come from, I would hope most educators would recognize this very quickly, but the responsibility for to be a leader for classroom teachers in North Carolina comes directly from the North Carolina Professional Teaching Standards.
Robert?
Yes.
May I interrupt? Could you close your handout because it's covering the screen?
Oh, thank you very much. I'm happy to do that. Your view and my view don't match. And I have mine is hidden behind the screen. Give me just a second. And I will make that go away.
You just need to click in the little top right-hand corner where it says handouts and just have it go back to the navigation bar on the GoToWebinar.
Well, I don't have the handout open here.
Okay, all right, then we've got it.
I want to see if one of the other staff members can confirm that the screen you're seeing says North Carolina Professional Teaching Standards.
Yes, it must have popped out on mine for a second.
Got it. Not a problem. I want to make sure everybody can see what they need to see. Give me just a second. We'll get this navigated back. Excellent. Thank you for keeping me moving. I've been watching the questions bar. I see a couple people have had some issues that have managed to get resolved, so thank you for your patience with that. This is very helpful. I appreciate that. So as we think about these professional teaching standards and where leadership comes from, the easiest place to find it, anybody who knows our standards, the easiest place to find it is, of course, going to be in Standard 1. The very name of Standard 1 is Teachers Demonstrate Leadership. But I want to talk a little bit about where you find that most explicitly identified in the standards. So as you look at Standard 1, I've just selected element B and element C as examples. You'll see that there are certain verbs that begin to show up: assumes a leadership role in the professional learning communities, collaborates with colleagues to improve the quality of learning in the school. So remember, in terms of those leadership opportunities, we had the resource provider and we had the classroom supporter. So resource provider and classroom supporter, while they're not named specifically, collaborating with colleagues, those are two examples where that collaboration could take, the way that that collaboration could be shaped. Also, being a data coach and being a catalyst for change are excellent examples of those. And you find in the next row, collaborating with school personnel on school improvement activities and assuming a leadership role in improving school improvement throughout the building. Now, I do want to point something out in this top pink box where I've outlined these 4 check boxes. I often get questions from folks because the verbs in the first pink column trade places in the second. We have in the top row, assumes a leadership role, followed by collaborates with colleagues. And yet below it, collaborates with school personnel precedes assuming a leadership role. And this is where, when you read these indicators, you've got to really consider the rest of the indicators. You'll see in the first row, assuming a leadership role in the professional learning community expands to collaborating colleagues to improve the quality of learning in the school. In the next row, collaborating with school personnel on school improvement activities expands to assuming a leadership role in implementing the school improvement plan throughout the entire building. As you move down to element 1C, you'll notice that an expectation here is promoting positive working relationships throughout the professional growth activities and collaborating with others. There's collaborating again. Promoting positive working relationships. If you're a teacher in an environment where those positive relationships do not yet exist, it's going to require you to be a catalyst for change. That teacher leadership expectation that's in the very first column of the list that I shared with you a moment ago. And then seeking opportunities to lead professional growth activities and decision-making processes. Now, what I want you to notice is these explicit examples of leadership that we find in the leadership standard are most obvious in the top 2 columns of the rubric. It is in the accomplished and the distinguished expectations of the leadership standard that leadership is most expressly indicated. And all of those 5 examples, from the informal and the semi-formal leadership examples from Harrison and Killian, are all embedded in the expectations. And this is only an example of 2 elements from Standard 1. So I see a question in the thing: do I need to have a formal leadership role to be a distinguished teacher? I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a little while, but just the short answer to that is no. You do not require a formal leadership role from the 3-column list I was looking at. In fact, if you have a formal leadership role from that list that is on the 3-column, you probably are no longer evaluated by this teacher rubric. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. It's the transition to the teacher leadership specialist rubric. So the idea of the teacher standards is that these leadership expectations and these standards, from developing, proficient, accomplished, all the way to distinguished, are accessible to every teacher in every building. The teacher may not aspire to them, they may not be achieving them, that may vary from year to year, but there have to be opportunities so that they're at least available to the teacher. There should not be barriers that prevent a teacher from seeking opportunities to lead professional growth activities and decision-making processes. Now, one of the ways a teacher can do that is by volunteering to be a member of the school improvement team, by engaging with the principal or the curriculum coordinator in the building to help provide support for teachers, either in professional development days or staff meetings. But the teacher would have to seek that out. They'd have to be proactive in finding that opportunity to do that. So I want to talk a little bit about where else we can find teacher leadership in the standards. The first one is easy. It's in the leadership standard itself. The second place that leadership is the easiest to find in the standards, and this actually relates to the question that I shared a moment ago, is in the distinguished column. If you take the distinguished column across all of the standards, 1 through 5, you will find language in the distinguished column that calls for and expects teacher leadership, specifically examples from the first 2 columns, those 5 examples from Harrison and Killian. And so what I've done here is taken the liberty of just capturing a snapshot, literally a slice of the distinguished column across multiple elements in the rubric. And you'll find in the center here, you see collaborates with teachers from other subject areas, promotes global awareness and its relevance to all faculty members. That could be an opportunity to be a catalyst for change. In the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you see stays abreast of emerging research. That is an expectation for a teacher to be a learner. You'll notice stays abreast of emerging research, and then if you move up above that, in that right-hand side, stays abreast of current research about student learning, and encourages and guides colleagues to adapt instruction to align with students' developmental needs. This expects teachers to be a learner, and it also expects teachers to be collaborative supporters of one another. So the distinguished column across all of the standards and elements is explicit in calling out teachers to lead. Someone asked, do you have to be on the school improvement team to be able to help make your school better in any area? I can think of many, many ways that an individual could help a school be better in some areas without having a formal role on a school improvement team at all. I just know that school improvement teams are a way that teachers can specifically request opportunities to be a part of specific systems of leadership. And there are places in the rubric that speak to school improvement practices, the improvement of the school and school improvement practices. Some are very formally articulated in school improvement plans, and some are less formally related to school improvement plans. But they're still a part of improving the school, improving the culture, improving the safety, whatever those happen to be. So, but they're school improvement, not individual classroom improvement or individual grade level improvement. They're more broad, they're larger, they're a part of the systematic impact at the building level. That's what we're talking about with school improvement. And in some cases, again, it's formally related to the school improvement plan, and in other cases, not necessarily. So let's talk about the third and final place that I think it's the easiest to find teacher leadership expectations in the teacher standards, and that is in Standard 5, which is the reflection standard. And that should come as no surprise. If you think about the reflection standard as a teacher's ongoing process for looking internally at their work and reflecting on their own learning to improve their practice, you would expect everything in the reflection standard to be about a teacher's growth and thus, as a learner, their leadership. So if you look And again, it's most explicit in the highest two columns of the rubric. So thinking systematically and critically about learning in their classroom, why learning happens, and what can be done to improve student achievement. So thinking systematically is being a learner. Why learning happens and what can be done if they take action to make the change, they're catalysts for change in their classroom. And when you move to the right to the distinguished column, provides a detailed analysis about what can be done to improve student learning and uses that analysis to adapt instructional practices and materials within the classroom, as well as contributing that learning so that you can help improve the school on a broader, larger level. So expanding the reach of that improvement effort beyond the walls of an individual classroom. So as we think about that, I would hope that any teacher who had the opportunity to really think hard about it and look at the rubric would be able to readily identify examples of where the rubric calls for the teacher to be a resource provider, a catalyst for change, a learner, a classroom supporter, and while it may not use the formal term, the idea of a data coach, someone that looks at examples of how students are doing, how their instruction is working, and making adjustments and improvements to that. Those 5 kinds of leadership found in the informal and the semi-formal examples of Harrison and Killian's 10 Roles for Teacher Leaders are readily available and readily accessible to teachers in the teacher standards. So making sure that teachers understand that they are called to lead, there are expectations that they be teacher leaders from their classrooms could be a really important dimension of your beginning of the year training and orientation to get teachers to really think a little more deeply about the rubric than perhaps they currently do when they take care of that step at the beginning of the year. So let's talk a little bit So the first 2 columns are embedded in the teacher rubric. This actually should come as no surprise if you think about the timing of the Harrison and Killian article. That article came out as these standards were being framed by the Professional Teaching Standards Commission back in 2006 and 2007. The North Carolina Professional Teaching Standards, you know, have the 5 domains: leadership, equity, content, instruction, instructional practice, and reflection. And we said that the easiest standards to find leadership opportunities and expectations are standard 1 and 5. I want to talk a little bit about the roles where these standards are in place. And if you think about a teacher's teaching career, what you see here on the screen is it's a grid that identifies generally the span of educator roles. Where might an educator be over a 30-year career in North Carolina? And what you see here is the very first column would be where a teacher would be while they're still in college. They're an aspiring teacher. They're enrolled in a teacher education program. For these students, there's a North Carolina pre-service rubric that's used to measure their practice and give them feedback for improvement while they're working on earning their teaching license. After that, a teacher becomes a beginning teacher. In North Carolina, you're a beginning teacher for the first 3 years of your career. You can only be a beginning teacher for 3 years of your career. After that, you either become an experienced teacher or you decide that teaching is not for you and you move on to something else. Experienced teachers are educators who've completed all of their beginning teacher requirements. And there is no shame in being an experienced teacher for an entire 30-year career. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. But if a teacher is an experienced teacher and they're doing a great job with kids, their principal is missing an incredible opportunity to encourage them to share those practices with others, to at the minimum, at the very least, let other teachers come in and watch what they're doing. If the principal is successful in encouraging that experienced teachers to let other people in the door to watch what they're doing, you actually have moved them to the next column. That teacher is then a model teacher. Any educator who shares and models best practices to others and lets them in the room is a model teacher. Now, some teachers are only comfortable with that. Come in and watch, and when you're done, leave. I don't want to talk to you about it. I don't want to discuss it, and that's okay. But When a teacher is a model teacher and they're showing and demonstrating things that other people can learn from, often having another set of eyes in the room is an opportunity for the model teacher to also learn him or herself. If the model teacher is open to dialogue and to learning from the people who are coming and doing the watching, they cross a really important line. They move into the category that's labeled on this graphic as a teacher leader. A teacher leader is still in the classroom and they're engaged in dialogue with others about instruction and about improvement. And in North Carolina, we have two kinds of teacher leadership that are currently readily visible in classrooms. The first is a single classroom teacher leader. For those of you that are principals, you probably can think of one or two in your building right now. And these are educators who still have responsibility for regular, direct instruction of students. They have a roster of students they're responsible for teaching. But they also provide leadership and support to other teachers. Some of these are formal through PLCs. Some of them are informal. The person on the team who has the resources that they share with others. A second kind of teacher leader that is visible in some classrooms in North Carolina. There are some specific districts that have taken this on formally. I know there are examples of multiple classroom teacher leaders in Charlotte-Mecklenburg and in Cabarrus County schools. There may be others. In these cases, these school districts have found ways to provide opportunities for educators to offer leadership and support to other teachers, and they take responsibility for the learning of the students that they teach, their own roster of students, as well as the students of those teachers that they're serving as a leader for. So if a third grade teacher was a multi-classroom teacher leader, they would provide support to the other third grade teachers on their team, and at the end of the year they would receive the EVOS information to speak to how much growth those kids got of their own students in their own rostered classroom, as well as all of the other students that they reached by leading and supporting the other third grade teachers. Multiple classroom teacher leadership opportunities are unique to districts that have taken the time to build out those systems. They are a part of some specific approaches that those districts that have them have taken on. The single classroom teacher leadership opportunity is probably more pervasive in North Carolina and more readily available because no special systems or structures are required to do that. But if you think about that, the North Carolina Professional Teaching Standards, the teacher standards, cover this much of this continuum of the span of educator roles. What we're going to talk about next is the Teacher Leadership Specialist Standards. So I've tried to carry us through generally what is leadership, where do those leadership expectations come from. They come from the standards. If you look carefully at the rubric, it's very obvious. You can find them, and they're most represented at the higher performance ends of the rubric. I wanted to go through that because, as you see from the continuum, the teacher standards cover a large percentage of the span of educator roles for educators in North Carolina. And if a teacher moves from a leadership role where they still have direct instructional responsibility for students, they actually change categories from being a teacher leader to being a leader of teachers. The learners for leaders of teachers are other adults more so than the students in the building. And I want to really kind of think about that difference, because that is the difference in, or the shift that takes place from whether you put a teacher on the North Carolina Professional Teaching Standards or whether you utilize the Teacher Leadership Specialist Standards. If a teacher is working with students for whom receiving information about students' EVOS growth for a roster of kids they're responsible for, they need to be on the North Carolina Professional Teaching Standards, because the outcomes and the expectations are about student learning. When we move to the Teacher Leadership Specialist Standards, the outcomes and the expectations are about the learning of the other adults that those teacher leaders are serving. So I want to talk a little bit about what teaching looks like. Teaching is very complex, and I would be naive to think that I can narrow what good teaching looks like down to a single slide. But I want to kind of run through this conceptual model just to get you to think about the role that standards play in a teacher's opportunity to improve and to be a leader. And teacher evaluation, whether it's the teacher standards or the teacher leadership standards, is just one element of a really complex system for improving educator effectiveness. And so what you see in the graphic here, in the large oval in the center, is a continuous improvement cycle. And that continuous improvement cycle is driven by 3 primary acts. And if you look, those are represented in the center in blue, 2 blue boxes and a double-sided arrow. And so what you see is, as you move from left to right, a teacher brings instructional inputs to the classroom, the teaching of the lesson itself. The lesson plan is the instructional input. There's the actual instruction that takes place, represented by the double-sided arrow. And the reason that's a double-sided arrow is everyone on this call knows that if you're in the middle of teaching and something you wrote in the lesson plan didn't design the lesson particularly well, you've got to nimbly work backwards, make those adjustments on the fly, and keep that instruction moving forward. So that's why the instruction graphic is a double-sided arrow in the center. This is the action the teachers take back and forth in responding and seeing what the kids are learning and where they need to adjust or make changes on the fly, so that ultimately they can be successful in helping the students reach those instructional outcomes, the third shape in that blue line in the center. Once a teacher has achieved those instructional outcomes with students, then the arrow at the bottom curves back around. Those instructional outcomes influence the next round of instructional inputs. And so in thinking about how that works, it's a continuous loop, it's a continuous cycle, as this continuous improvement is going constantly. It's like that little arrow in the oval is going around and around and around and around, but it's not done individually. Teachers are doing this in professional learning communities, and they're doing it through collaborative coaching, but they may not call it that. And they're doing it through action research, even though they may not call it that. Anytime a teacher works with a colleague to talk through their practices, I had this really tough time with this, I wasn't sure how to do it, and another teacher gives them a recommendation. Those are natural collaborative coaching processes. Anytime a teacher tries something, realizes it either did work or it didn't work, and makes adjustments to their instructional inputs to improve this cycle, that is action research. Most teachers don't call it that, but that's exactly what it is. So as you think about this oval and this movement of this machine called instruction, this continuous improvement process that's happening in classrooms every day, one of the jobs of the principal is to peek into that and draw out some important information. And so some of the information that gets drawn out of that at the very beginning of the year, every year a teacher does a self-assessment on their own practices. And you'll discover up near the upper left, there's a call-out box for a self-assessment. The teacher has to do the self-assessment from the frame of what they know about their own instruction. From that self-assessment, the teacher designs professional development goals. And those professional development goals are built into the professional development plan, which should be naturally and seamlessly related to the job and the work and the role of the teacher instructionally throughout the year. If the professional development plan is not seamlessly related to what the teacher needs to be working on to really refine their practices as well as they possibly can, it could be a distraction for the overall improvement process that the teacher is trying to take place. In most cases, you're going to build out those professional development goals from both the self-assessment and from the previous year's evaluation feedback that was received. Now, principals, one of the things that you have to do from time to time is peek into this continuous improvement loop by actually physically stepping into classrooms and doing classroom observations. From those classroom observations, you provide formative feedback to the teacher. Classroom observations are about formative feedback as you help them to think about what happened, as you describe what you saw, and you hear from them what their thoughts were about the lesson. From those classroom observations, you get a lens into two kinds of practice, and those are located in the bottom left and the bottom right of this graphic. You get a sense of their professional practice, and you get a sense of their instructional practice. Now, as you think about the 5 standards of the North Carolina Professional Teaching Standards, the professional practice standards are standard 1 and 5, leadership and reflection. Those are the 2 standards that speak to what the teacher is doing to improve and to scaffold their professional actions and their professional behavior. Standards 2, 3, and 4 are instructional practice standards. All 3 of those. Standard 2 is about equity, Standard 3 is about content knowledge and content instruction, and Standard 4 is about instructional practices. So, as a principal, you're looking into this continuous improvement cycle as the teacher takes instructional inputs, translates them into instruction, then yields the outcomes to feed into the next round of inputs. And you're looking for examples of professional and instructional practice. So as you think about this system, the North Carolina Professional Teaching Standards, the Teaching Standards Rubric, is specifically utilized in 4 of those 6 examples in the graphic. The self-assessment, the teacher does that from the rubric. You use the very same rubric as you do classroom observations. You describe and give feedback in post-conferences on professional and instructional practices using this rubric. So, 2 really important terms as we think about evaluation and the formative feedback are evaluation and supervision. Evaluation is the systematic judgment of evidences by a knowledgeable other for the summative purpose of assigning a rating. Evaluation happens at the end. Supervision is intentional interaction with knowledgeable others for the formative purpose of improving practice. So supervision takes place anytime a teacher is getting feedback on their instruction from others. That could be from a principal, it could be from a peer, it could be done in a formal or a very informal way, but that's supervisory. We don't use that term very often, unfortunately. The last time you probably heard it was when you had a student teaching supervisor who came to support you as you were in your teaching as a student teacher. So, lots of opportunities to lead coming directly from the standards for teachers. Let's make a shift to these formal examples. The teacher leadership standards were designed in 2013-2014 to close the gap because we had the 5 examples in the first 2 columns were readily evident in the teacher standards, but when teachers shifted to roles like instructional specialists, curriculum specialists, instructional facilitators, they call them learning facilitators, the specific mentoring role that people take on, and then other school instructional leaders, the other 5 that I have classified in this formal category of leadership. Those aren't readily available to every educator in North Carolina, and it would be inappropriate to articulate those expectations in the teaching standards. So, as we think about that, these are for roles that have shifted across this line to become leaders of teachers. These are folks whose primary job it is to help the other adults in the building improve their practice. So as we think about that, I want to talk a little bit about how these standards came to be. There was a committee that put these standards together in 2013-2014. They didn't invent them in a vacuum. They took a set of national standards, the teacher leader model standards. You can find these online. Just type in Google and this brochure will come right up. It articulated several domains for teacher leadership. I think there are 7 that are part of what teacher leaders can do and they would say should be doing in instructional classrooms. But in North Carolina, we knew that we had the framework of the teacher standards and the 5 domains of leadership, equity, content knowledge, instructional practice, and reflection. And we wanted that context of those 5 domains to be the same across all other support staff rubrics. So you find that the teacher leadership standards have the same 5 domains. The teacher leadership standards, the first standard is leadership, The second standard is equity. The third standard is content knowledge. The fourth standard is facilitating instruction. And standard 5 is all about reflection. So the teacher evaluation process, how often does a teacher leader on the teacher leadership standards have to be observed? It parallels the expectations for classroom teachers. So for teachers who are observed 3 times on the classroom rubric, the same expectations would be true for a teacher leader. So the same number of observations. Remember, I said a moment ago that the outputs for a teacher leader are adult learning, whereas the outputs for a classroom teacher are student learning. Teacher leadership specialists serve a role in school improvement by helping other teachers to refine their practice. That is the role of a teacher leader. You may call them instructional resource teachers, you may call them curriculum coaches, you may call them math coaches, you may call them literacy coaches. Depending on your district, there is an array of names for these roles. But the primary thing they have in common is they're helping other teachers to refine their practice. To get at and to understand, it's important that teacher leaders have a deep understanding of the teacher standards, because their job is to help other teachers improve their practices on those standards. So as you think about it, this is standard 1 from the teacher leadership specialist standards. Element A says that teachers are going to facilitate teamwork and leadership, and I have specifically highlighted or put in bold the actions of teacher leaders. And element B is about modeling collaboration and facilitating professional learning. Element C is about advocating for students, advocating for educators, advocating for schools and educational programs. And then element D is about demonstrating high ethical standards. In short, the expectation of a teacher leader in the teacher leadership specialist standards is that they are helping the other teachers in the building become better leaders. If a teacher leadership specialist is doing their job well, one of the evidences is their own behavior, but another evidence is the degree to which the teachers they are leading are improving in their own leadership practices. As we move to standard 2, and remember standard 2 is about equity, we want teacher leadership specialists to support environments that are respectful of a diverse population of educators. So not only diversity in the classroom, but diversity across the school building among and within the educators themselves. So element A speaks to modeling respectful communication strategies, and element B speaks to differentiating professional learning to meet the diverse learning needs in the school and the district. So just as teachers are expected to differentiate their instruction and practice for kids, teacher leadership specialists are expected to differentiate the professional learning that they provide to meet the needs of the other educators in the building. So in short, standard 2 is about helping all of the teachers in the building become more skilled at working with diverse learners. And the teacher leadership specialist is doing this both directly by helping to teach the teachers those strategies and indirectly by modeling those strategies themselves in the work that they do with other educators in the building. Standard 3 is the content standard, and I want to talk a little bit more about this. Standard 3 says teacher leadership specialists incorporate adult learning strategies and effective teaching and learning practices as they implement change. Element A is about aligning support within the professional teaching standards. Element B is to use their knowledge of the structure and content of the North Carolina Standard Course of Study. Element C is about understanding the dynamic nature of teaching and learning. Element D is about engaging colleagues in challenging conversations about data. Teacher leaders who are on this rubric need to be able to facilitate tough discussions about data. Where are the kids getting it? Where are they not getting it? What do we need to do to try to close those gaps? And then E, using effective adult learning strategies to support the stages of change and innovation. So for a math teacher, Standard 3 is all about math. For a science teacher, Standard 3 is all about science. For an English language arts teacher, Standard 3 is all about English language arts. For a teacher leadership specialist, the content of Standard 3 is not math or science or social studies. They need to understand the structure of the standard course of study. That's what element B is all about. But the content that a teacher leader who is a teacher leadership specialist needs to master is adult learning strategies supporting effective adult learning strategies, and supporting the stages of change as they implement and help teachers refine their practice. So part of the work in Standard 3 is that teacher leadership specialists are helping teachers become stronger in their own content area. And so what the teacher leadership specialists need to be skilled at is adult learning practices, and they have to know the structure of the standard course of study across all content areas. Standard 4 is the instruction standard. And in Standard 4, teacher leaders are expected to help maximize the effectiveness of the educators in the building, to help the educators to improve their practice by employing a variety of resources and skills to support them in doing that, to employ appropriate and available technology. So not technology for technology's sake, but are we applying it in the place that it makes the most sense to accomplish the outcomes that we're looking for? And then finally, to incorporate the framework for 21st century learning to enhance the educator's instructional planning and assessment. 21st century skills are the underpinnings of Standard 4 for teachers, and they are specifically identified in element D of Standard 4 for teacher leaders. So in short, the expectation of teacher leaders in Standard 4 is they're helping the other teachers in the building become stronger in their instructional practices. In Standard 5, we're asking the teacher leadership specialists to engage in and facilitate reflective practice. So be a reflective practitioner themselves, but also support teachers in becoming more reflective. And remember, Standard 5 for teachers is one of the places that leadership opportunities, informal and semi-formal, are most readily evident. So if the teacher leader can help the teachers do that, one of the questions was, how do you prove to an evaluator that what you're doing as a leader, and what should teachers be doing to create artifacts from the different forms of leadership that they're participating in? I think using the rubric to identify specific examples of artifacts could be very helpful, but I think this identifying leadership practices could be best cultivated in a building if the teacher leader in the building, the instructional coach, the curriculum specialist were actually engaged with a group of teachers to help them identify those practices and processes. Any educator who's trying to identify evidences to bring forth at a post-conference should go to the rubric by which they are evaluated as the beginning place to look for examples of the work that they're doing. So one of the things in Standard 5 for teacher leaders is to help teachers assess their effectiveness and revise their practices based on their findings. So getting in there and helping teachers be those action researchers that we saw a moment ago in the instructional cycle that I shared with you. And then leadership specialists base their own professional development activities on the needs of those they serve. Just like a teacher would say, I've got to help my kids understand this concept and I don't know how to do it, so I'm going to go take a workshop to teach me how. The teacher leadership specialist needs to be doing the very same thing. As they identify specific things within the school's skills, talents, and culture that need to be adjusted or need to be refined, that teacher leader may need to seek out professional learning opportunities to help support those systems and those changes that need to occur. And then finally, teacher leadership specialists need to facilitate reflective practice in others by both modeling it, but also providing systems, structures, support, and resources to help teachers be reflective. So in short, Standard 5 expects teacher leadership specialists to help teachers become more reflective in their practice. The job of a teacher leadership specialist is to help other teachers refine their practice. They need to understand the teacher rubric as well as they understand their own rubric. One important thing to be aware of, while there are connections across the teacher standards and the teacher leadership standards, the expectations of practice are similar, but they are a little higher for teacher leadership specialists. And I want to talk about that just a little bit. I am sure several of you on this call have been in a professional development setting with either myself or one of my colleagues who's on the line with us, where we've shared that across the rubric, the expectations of the first column are looking for knowledge. The expectations of the second column are looking for action. The third column is looking for interaction, and the fourth column is looking for distinguished. So developing practice shows the teacher has the knowledge only. Proficient says that they're taking the actions appropriately. Accomplished says that as they take those actions, interactions are visible to show that it's successful. And then finally, distinguished practice for teachers is when there is an extension of the skill or the improvement or the value add beyond their simple classroom, but expanded more broadly to the grade level or to the school building. As we think about what teacher leadership specialists are expected to do, the developing level for teacher leadership specialists, knowledge is not enough. People are elevated to these teacher leadership specialist roles because they have the knowledge. It was an entry point for the job. So the developing column for teacher leadership specialists expects action. You'll find action verbs in the first column of the teacher leadership specialist rubric. Proficient is looking for interaction. So the teacher leadership specialist is proficient at their work if the things that they do yield results. If they're not yielding visible results, that's a developing teacher leader. If they're yielding results, you have proficient teacher leadership taking place. The accomplished teacher leader, not only are they yielding results, but they're extending and expanding beyond the single place. So if an accomplished teacher leader has a grade level working together on improving their practices, and then they convince the other grade level to pick up some of those practices, and they extend and expand those things more broadly, then that's beginning to move into the accomplished direction. And then finally, unique to the teacher leadership standards is this idea of synthesis. You'll find language in the distinguished column of the teacher leadership rubric that speaks to new systems coming available, new processes emerging. And so teacher leaders are expected to create a synthesis of new high-quality practices in the building. It is 5 o'clock. And that was the very last slide. I'm ending right on the wire. I've tried to address a couple of the questions that looked like they were broadly relevant across the team. My colleagues who've been on the call have been really working hard to answer questions individually, and I see that where there were questions about resources and how to get to things, they have shared those as well. There was a question about the presentation and the handout. The recording will be archived on the NISA's wiki. We can certainly make sure that the handout is there as well if you wanted to have that handout for use. The references for that original article, the Harrison Killian's 10 roles, is there on the handout, so you could find that if you wanted to go back to the original article and actually read it. I want to thank everybody for your time and attention this afternoon. I know you have been had a very busy day, and it's a long way to end the day with a webinar in the very last hour of the day. So I will keep the webinar open for about 3 or 4 more minutes, just in case there are questions in the question bar that need to be addressed. And but I'm going to end the audio at this time. Dalia, if you want to end the recording at this time, I think this would be appropriate.